Welcome to a dialogue on accountability in the digital age, a dialogue with representatives of a global, multi-stakeholder community.
I'm your host, Frits Bussemaker, and today I'm delighted and privileged to have a conversation with Professor Ali Hessami. Ali, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Fritz.
You are a professor and a visiting professor at the London City University Centre for Systems and Control, and also at Beijing Yaotong University for Electronics Information. But we are going to speak to you as the process architect of the IEEE Ethics Certification Program for Autonomous and Intelligent Systems from the IEEE Standards Association. Now, this is not the first time you have taken on such a great endeavor, so we will also talk about one of the books you've written on this topic. So again, Ali, thank you for joining us. And I'd like to begin with the standard, the IEEE P7000 standard, which focus on addressing ethical concerns in system design.
Yes.
Why was that design needed?
The matters of autonomy and algorithmic learning provided a societal challenge that humanity has not faced until now, in the sense that decisions made by non-human agents that can't be easily challenged or redressed have posed the necessity for looking into basically making machines in charge of running human affairs. Now, that led to, okay, these are largely ethical concerns, but who has got guidelines on how engineers handle this? Because engineers are scientists, they deal with scientific and physical properties and phenomena, and there was the dearth of insufficient guidance in terms of how you identify what an ethical concern and how does that impact on the design, if at all. So in the absence of those, IEEE initiated a global program for ethics of autonomous intelligent systems, which is their way of referring to AI, back in 2015. And in 2016, a standard called IEEE 7000 was initiated. And the purpose of that standard, as you rightly highlighted, was to offer a way of addressing ethical concerns to engineers and scientists who were involved in articulating, designing, and developing autonomous intelligent systems for handling anything from education to health to financial services.
Okay, now the way you framed it, you could assume that each individual engineer should know about the standard. Is that your audience, or is it more the quality assurance, quality control type of departments?
No, it's pretty much, frankly, the designers and developers of embedded AI solutions, largely a technocentric approach. Of course, the standard recommends consultation with key stakeholders, etc. But the know-how exchanged in the standard and exposed in the standard is all about engineers knowing what is ethics and why have I not been told in my university training how to handle a requirement that a given stakeholder holds, but and it's not in my requirements list.
Okay, so this also would give an engineer a guideline to their client to refuse or adapt a request.
Well, things are a bit more complex than that. Traditionally, system engineering is founded on so-called requirements engineering, and that's a large discipline in its own right in terms of how you elicit the requirements, how you verify them, how you incorporate them in the design. And it's not as simple as having a few hundred requirements and designing them all in. There's often an enormous degree of horse trading and balancing between quality requirement, safety requirement, performance requirement, commercial requirement, all this standard is striving to do is to throw in one other category that has been eluding us, if you like, so far, until
Okay.
the challenges of AI came about and say, here is a set of new requirements relating to human rights and values that you engineers might not have handled before.
Yeah. Now, being an engineer myself, I recognize the horse trading, as you just mentioned. Now, IEEE is a global organization, so I also would assume global application of the standard. How many horse trading was there involved in formulating the ethical standards as they are right now?
There were a number of, as I mentioned, there was a global initiative and it had few strands, one of them developing AI ethics standards. And currently they stand around 14 of those. About half of those have already been completed because they have started 5-6 years ago. And the rest are work in progress in final stages. In terms of actual 7000, which is the core standard, and it's a universal, global, and generic standard for addressing ethics in any system design, including autonomous intelligence systems, that easily took 5 years. There was a significant amount of argument, debate, disagreement even. When I joined as a member of the working group and realized that this is not an easy going place because of the clash of values, clash of perspectives. And frankly, if you look at the world today, globally and even politically, that clash is still there. We have not come to accommodate every view to the satisfaction of the holders of those views. And they were not very different in this standard. And I was trying, initially I was a member. Due to circumstances, I became the technical editor, and almost within months, I took over as the chair and running and directing the standard. And of course, the main input of the standard came from Professor Spiekermann from University of Economics and Business in Vienna. Nevertheless, the working group members, a very large number for a standard, because it had attracted a wide group of very diverse people, with people from engineering, people from legal dimension, people from ethical background, people from general interest background. And each one of these groups, given that this is ethics and it's about humanity, had their own perceived or real view of what ethics is and how it should go into technology. So there was a significant amount of argumentation, and eventually after 5 years we all agreed that we were not going to get any further and better come to some consensus perspective that majority accepted. But the work, if you like, wasn't finished, but we decided that this is an ongoing dialogue.
Okay.
And for practical reasons, we better get something published.
Okay, so in that sense, it's a pragmatic document in the sense that you have made some choices. Does this also mean it's supported by a coalition of the willing?
Indeed. Ultimately, the way IEEE develops the standards, first of all, it's an open process. So it's not unlike CENELEC in Europe, where you have representatives nominated from national committees, etc. IEEE's process is entirely open door policy. Bakers and butchers and whoever is interested can walk in and join a working group.
Yeah.
So that was one complication.
Yeah. Okay, and does this also mean that individual regions, countries can adopt this global framework to their own needs?
Indeed. When I joined, I realized it was largely biased towards Western values, if you like, towards Aristotle and John Stuart Mill and Immanuel Kant's views of what ethics is in terms of virtues and in terms of duties and in terms of benefits and disbenefits. So I requested people who had been involved in drafting to include a fourth leg to allow the rest of the humanity to have values other than what was promoted by these three canons of Western philosophy, basically. So now we currently have basically four ways of looking ethically at any product or service, being it virtual or physical. And through those pairs of glasses, we identify values which are either being fostered by a technology or being threatened by a technology. And as a result, we generate requirements that go for protection of any values and rights that are undermined.
Okay, and what is that fourth viewpoint, by the way?
Well, we didn't give it a particular label because the others all attributed to the originator, philosopher, thinker of largely Western canon. And the fourth leg is like almost like whatever other source of value a given community has or holds dear to their heart, being their history, being their culture, being their belief system, is as valid as what Aristotle or Immanuel Kant decided that we need to take on board to honor our duties towards human community.
Oh, I got that. And probably you've already have answered this question because the standard talks about value-based engineering. So that means adapted to the local culture and ethics?
Well, within reason, it's largely founded on those three schools of so-called utilitarianism. What are the good things? What are the bad things? What are the benefits? What are the harms? The second bit is what are the duties of those guys who are in charge making this, the corporation, the senior executives, etc. And finally, the third question is, from Aristotle's point of view, in what way does this product or service, the way it's conceived and is going to be operated, going to affect the personal virtues and values of an individual in terms of integrity and honesty and that kind of thing. So the fourth dimension that I mentioned complemented the three-legged stool of thought. And in reality, I think now we are capable of absorbing, but the standard itself as it stands doesn't adapt easily to, for example, the Confucian value system or Ubuntu value system in Africa or any other value system in Mayans and Aztecs or Latin America for that matter.
Okay, so that could mean that still, go ahead.
Sorry.
No, but that could mean that in the future you could adopt for those standards or those perspectives if needed. It's flexible.
It is flexible by adding that fourth leg, that these are three sort of instruments. If you found another way of identifying values, even if they came from your belief system or just, I don't know, naturism, if you wanted to, then those values are as valid to be considered in the design as what you discovered through John Stuart Mill's utilitarianism pair of glasses.
Okay, now would you agree in my take on what you just taken us with us that it's an engineering approach to setting standards?
Well, indeed, we have made it as close to engineering as possible. It's not in conflict with any other process, including agile design of products and services, where you basically do not go through the traditional sequential life cycle base. You do this followed by that, etc. It can be as agile and is compliant with IEEE 15288 lifecycle processes and process model. So in principle, yes, it's guidance how ethics get included in design, basically scientific engineering design activities.
Now, we'll make certain that the viewers will be pointed to the right link that they can read upon those standards. Now, one of the reasons you got involved, Ali, because you also written a couple of books relevant to this topic. And the latest book, Factoring Ethics in Technology Policymaking, that's what our institute is all about, accountability in a digital age. Because to finish that title is it's about the regulation of AI. And you've made quite an interesting remark in the beginning of the book, and you said AI is a very unlevel playing field. Can you please expand?
Well, it's largely about behavior of basically corporations in adoption of AI, as well as the practices that we have witnessed and Europe has woken up to and invented GDPR and AI Act for. And that is, it is an unlevel playing field insofar as there are, if you like, lesser empowered groups and far more capable and less transparent and less accountable entities in the total ecosystem. And I mean, let's face it, for example, from disabled to children to underage, etc. None of these groups have been protected against the onslaught of automation, onslaught of web services. And in a sense, suddenly the society is at a major deficit dealing with artifacts that look very glossy, very glitzy, very interesting, but what we are trading in terms of being profiled, our data, our dignity being undermined through the way a service provider is taking advantage of our honesty and reading a big list of terms and conditions and just ticking it off because we don't have the time and patience. It's a very unlevel playing field on that basis. And the society is technically waking up a bit too sluggishly and too slowly to the realization that loss of your personal information is not just about somebody having your date of birth, is almost reading your mind, almost undermining your agency, almost to the point that you could become vulnerable for the information that's in the hands of those, and you don't know even what they hold on you and what inferences they are making to sell you anything from an expensive investment to an electric motor vehicle, etc. So these are the dimensions that are behind that edited book. And I was keen, together with my co-author, who's a lawyer, Trish Shaw, to actually bring that reality in front of the, if you like, decision makers and say, this is an unlevel playing field. For some reason, legislation and regulation hasn't caught up with the pace of innovation. And this is almost like a wild horse.
Okay, now,
no controls.
Yeah, but then the question is, because that's also the core of what we're talking about, accountability in a digital age. Can the legislation keep up with that very fast developing digital technology? And would that mean you might want to consider alternatives for regulatory frameworks?
Absolutely. I think you put your finger on the soft spot here, and that is our traditional way of regulating against products and services in terms of protection of safety and security and welfare of the public is no longer in tune with the pace and the diversity and transformative nature of technology. And here we are at the outset, it's been around for quite a few years now, outset of a whole new technological innovation as on par with the invention of the steam engine at the start of the Industrial Revolution. We are having an AI engine entering our life, from watching our health to watching our pocket to watching our interests, etc. And we have no fast-paced, agile, if you like, mechanism for catching up with these things.
Yeah.
Typically, just mentioned 7,000 took 5 years. If you take 5 years to write a standard how to do this and that against an emerging piece of technology, you can imagine by the time you have finished, that technology can probably has ceased to exist in the form you wanted to control it. And the same applies to regulation.
So
our means are not suitable.
Okay, so if you are aware that that's reality, are you already thinking about alternatives still to mitigate that risk and close that gap?
Absolutely.
Do you have any ideas of possible solutions we should look into?
Sure. We actually experimented. I must admit, the traditional approach is the law and the standards are written in narrative. So a bunch of gray-haired expert people get together, lawyers or legal representatives, and after thrashing out the key issues, write 100 pages or whatever in
Yep.
terms of what's allowed and what's not allowed and what are the duties of this group and that group, etc. Frankly, I think that method itself gets lost in the intricacies of fighting over the meanings and words and concepts, etc. And what we experimented with in another program that we haven't discussed, and that was ethics certification program that I have been honored to run for IEEE Standard Association. We developed a model-based approach. This works amazingly fast. It captures just the essential bits that are significant in a given context. And because it's a model and it's pictorial and basically a graphical representation of a book, it leaves you an immediate impression, and you can decipher, because our image processing capabilities are far stronger than our word processing capabilities. Okay. So at a single view, we work out, is this adequate? Is there anything missing? And the other beauty is that if it's a model and it's a picture rather than 100 pages of writing full of bullet points and so on, you can easily review this in matters of weeks and catch up with the next evolution of whatever it is you're trying to control. If you want to revisit a standard, typically it takes 2 years.
Is this something the world, I'll say, is ready for, that alternative way to regulate? Because we're a little bit conservative in that respect. We want law to catch up, but that's not going to happen. So we need to look at alternatives.
I think so. And we don't need to throw the baby and bathwater out and say narrative-based 100-page regulations are not good enough. We can start experimenting in parallel and say, here's a regulation. It took 9 months to develop. And with the help of lawyers and legal specialists, the same concepts produced as an image, as a model of what is involved in this controlling this particular facet of technology, took 6 weeks. Now, the truth is, frankly, this is just one way of thinking, but the necessity for being agile and commensurate with the pace and transformation of technology is there. What the optimum solution is, by no means claiming that we've got the optimum, but at least we found a way to cut back by a factor of 3 or 4 the time scale and duration and arguments over shall and should and wording, etc., which also has different meaning in different cultures. In one culture, they're sensitive on equity, the other one on equality, for example. So this is the way our solution, that we need agile methods and using graphics and models rather than narratives and then translate that into umpteen language, is probably one of those agile methods that if it proves its virtue, hopefully will be more dominant than spending 3 years to 5 years agreeing on a text.
That's very good to take note of that, and also share it with the rest of the audience. There are solutions which have the potential to catch up.
Indeed.
And a little bit on another topic, but I was quite interesting. You mentioned, you used a term in your book called AI ethics colonization. To some extent, I tie that into your earlier remark on level playing field. Mm-hmm. Is that what AI ethics colonization is about, and what do we have to be careful of?
Exactly the points made earlier. If you look at the colonial history, colonialism is shameless exploitation of a community for their resources, even for their own physical strengths, taking their property and taking away their dignity and their rights, because they happen to be weaker than you, or they happen to be less informed in a given context. And what's happening in the domain of data economy is not far from a modern form of colonization, that enterprises in a fairly opaque and non-transparent way cultivate people's data. Data is there for the taking. Exactly the mindset of a colonialist. So there is a piece of land there, the people are incapable of defending themselves, but they are sitting on wealth, sitting on gold and natural, etc. We can, so why not go and grab it? Who is there? Whoever stands up to us, we fight, and ultimately the winner takes it all. And that mindset dominates the behavior of, if you like, at least the AI domain in terms of value of data. Wherever from, you just take it without accountability, without owning up for it. And then then these enterprises go and cultivate that and turn it into almost CFDs and sell it to others. Not just, there are many examples. I use only one as a streaming service, that you bought a right to listen to music, and they decided your way of listening and selections that you made in listening to music could reveal something about your mental state, whether you're vulnerable, whether you are depressed, whether you are overjoyed, etc. And that information could be of value to a boilerplate investment person who wants to find people in a vulnerable state to sell them something that doesn't stand up to value scrutiny, so to speak. So this kind of mindset is behind that so-called rather strong word colonizing, but the mindset is the same. If you look historically at the process of colonization, and what's happening in the data economy, there are huge parallels.
Okay, now assuming that we don't want the colonization to take place, is a standard enough? How do we enforce these standards, these guidelines? What are your thoughts?
Well, naturally, standards are not enough. As much as we've already argued, regulations are not enough. And my honest perspective is that, first of all, standards are voluntary instruments. Unless they are mandated by a contract or by regulation, they are just good stuff agreed by a bunch of consensus-seeking technocrats or legal experts, and that's it. So in order to do any good, these standards need to do a couple of things. One is that to be promoted so that people know there is something that could protect them. They could include it in their contracts, for example. And that's what exactly government procurement systems do. When they want to purchase from a global community, they look for international standards that cover that particular facet of that piece of technology. And they go and say, well, this is, we only argue on the price, but in terms of behaviors, conform to that standard, and that's a good enough basis for our acceptance. So standards are voluntary, not enough. Regulations are too old-fashioned in the way they are conceived and implemented. By the time you train the police force and the legal system to understand, this technology is very elusive. It's changing fundamentally, and it also doesn't have a home where you can attack and arrest someone. You can sit on unknown server in a territory that you have no jurisdiction in. So in principle, means of enforcement are also incommensurate with the nature of the challenge society is facing. I must admit, I have a lot of respect for the European approach and European Union's protection of the European citizens on matters related to data economy and AI. And I think these are exemplary approaches, never sufficient, but in the context of the vacuum that we have faced in the face of colonialist attitude by the big technology corporations, is a very good start.
It's, well, good to hear that. A couple of more questions, Ali, maybe one personal one and one on your stake on What's the biggest threat for accountability today, given the discussion we just had?
Well, we actually developed characteristics of accountability for AI applications. And frankly, the biggest threat for accountability to me, and it's incorporated in our so-called ethical criteria for measurement of accountability in the context of AI application, was organizational recognition that matters of ethics are as significant as shareholder value. Now, if we do not make that kind of transition, if we do just suffice with so-called corporate social responsibility or ESG and just play with words, accountability, like charity, starts at home. The organization, in terms of its governance model, in terms of its capabilities, that it means what it says and it incorporates it, as well as promotes it, not only internally for its own structure and staff and ways of doing things, but also towards its stakeholders externally. Interestingly, this so-called organizational governance dimension appears in all the suites of ethical criteria that we have developed on transparency, on algorithmic bias, on privacy and accountability, because it's so fundamental. Get it right at home and then practice it for others.
That seems to be also the answer to the second question I wanted to ask you, and is where would you put your effort? And that is at home.
I think so. It's definitely, it makes it more sustainable. If it is just question of we are after a certificate for this car or this artifact or this medical device, but we are too busy, leave us alone. We don't have time for this mumbo jumbo. We don't have time to appoint an ethics officer inside our organization with, I don't know, direct line to the chief executive to also stop a project and question the merits or demerits of a project, even in defense systems, frankly. Then frankly, the rest of it would be almost what they call ethics washing. That is, there are no real genuine intent behind the moves and deeds, yet there is a surface and a facade that, trust us, we care for you. So in a sense, let's start the charity at home. Let's get organizations aligned with ethical values, like have an ethical policy statement, put it in public, and then deliver everything internal, external, according to that accountable policy. If that policy is in the public domain, it is a very brave statement by any enterprise to say, these are the values we uphold. We respect all human rights. We respect the, I don't know, the minorities. We respect the underprivileged in the society, and we won't contravene that. And if we did, come and challenge us. I think, honestly, if we achieve that status, we have made a huge progression on matters of accountability and indeed becoming ethical. I often finish by saying the transition that society needs to make in 21st century after Adam Smith and Wealth of Nations is to try and move from shareholder value to societal value. If we make that transition, we end up being an enlightened society or global community. Otherwise, it's all fluffy stuff and substance would be missing.
Ali, those are great words to end this discussion with. So there is hope for the future.
Indeed.
How do we make that change? Thank you so much for sharing your insights.
Pleasure. Lovely to see you. Thank you.